Welcome everybody to the latest Bringing Wholesale Together webinar brought to you from FWD. Today we're going to be talking about the British general election, which, as you will all know, takes place on July the 4th. We're going to hear an overview about what's happening in terms of the background of the election, some of the timeframes, and a bit of detail on what the first 100 days of a new government might look like, should, as the polls suggest, Labour take office. And then on the basis of those polls, we're going to be hearing from Carl Shoben, Director of Strategic Communications at Survation, leading pollsters, who's going to be taking us through the polls, where we are, and how things are playing out at the moment. So please do feel free to ask some questions as we go along in the chat. But I think people are gathering, but I think we will kick off because it is 1 minute past 2. So I'm delighted to introduce, to open the webinar today, Catherine Morgan, Managing Partner at DGA. Hello, Catherine. And also Lewis, who's an associate at DGA. Hello, Lewis. And they're going to be talking to you a little bit about some of the background to the election, bit of an overview about what's been happening so far. So, Catherine, over to you.
Thanks very much, James, and great to be here. We are going to share some slides as we go through, which Lewis is just going to put up now. And if you have any questions as we go through, as James mentioned, please do put those into the chat and we will come back to them. So just to kick off, Lewis is going to do a slideshow view on the slides. And as James has said, and as you all know, the election has been announced for 3 weeks' time, July the 4th, Independence Day, and it was a snap election. Not many people were expecting it to happen this side of the summer recess, of the summer holidays, including many Conservative MPs. So it took many by surprise, and many have been questioning why Sunak went so early when he could have waited a bit longer to see how things were going to develop with the economy. But moving on to the next slide, just in terms of the timelines that we're looking at for the election and the road to the 4th of July. We're already partway through this process here. We've had what's called a 2-day wash-up, where the previous government agreed various outstanding pieces of legislation and rushed through key things that could be agreed on from both sides. We've gone through a period of selecting various parliamentary candidates for the different political parties. And as you will have seen, the television hustings and debates have already begun. So the campaign is now 3 weeks in, very much in the middle of the campaign, in the middle of the momentum. The Labour Party manifesto was published today. We're just reviewing that now and looking at if there's any additional significant proposals in there. It doesn't look like there are particularly at the moment, but it's interesting to see the detail of what's very likely to be the next government. We also had the Conservative manifesto published, as you will have seen, on Tuesday, and the Liberal Democrat manifesto published on Monday, and the Green manifesto published yesterday. So very much the election process is in full swing. And then we have, as well as all of the political activity that's going on, civil servants behind the scenes in government are now very busy preparing for new ministers, setting out what their agendas and priorities should be. And as we go on to the next slide, here is a little bit about what's going to happen after polling day. So Parliament will return shortly after the election on the Tuesday, but won't sit formally until what's called the King's Speech on the 17th. And we think it's going to be on the 17th of July. And in the King's Speech, the King will set out what Labour proposes to do, what legislation it proposes to prioritise in its first period of government, in its first term. And we will also very significantly and importantly hear about which ministers are going to go into the cabinet and which junior ministers are put in place as well. So there'll be an incredibly busy period in July as ministers are allocated. Potentially there's some shift of departments and change in the departmental structure, and we hear about the legislative programme. And we may see, normally Parliament ends around the 2nd or 3rd week of July, we may see that there is an extended period for Parliament to sit in July, possibly an extra week happening to enable the new government to get its feet under the desk. And then they have a summer break and they will return in September. So just finally, before we hand over to Carl, who will talk about the polling and the fun stuff, here's some of the highlights, which I'm sure you will have picked up on from the campaign trail so far. Of course, Rishi Sunak hasn't had a very good campaign. It started badly when he got drenched, and he's had various other gaffes, including the Sky TV debate, which didn't go very well for him yesterday. Keir Starmer has been incredibly cautious throughout the campaign and just looks to do very little and make sure that nothing will dent the solid and significant poll lead that Labour has. And Ed Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats, looks to have really enjoyed the campaign so far. Some have questioned his approach, but it's certainly been eye-catching, and I'm sure a few of you will have seen him falling off a paddle boat into Lake Windermere, going on a roller coaster, amongst other things. So some of the highlights, but I'll hand over to Carl, who will now talk us through the polls and what the prospects are looking like for the next government.
Just to very quickly introduce myself, I currently work for Survation as their Director of Strategic Communications, which means that I use all the data available to work with Survation's clients, which are sometimes political parties, sometimes campaign groups or businesses, to help them understand the data and to shape their messaging and campaign strategy around the use of data. And that's what I've done for many years. I was once a special advisor to Tony Blair in his government, and I was also director of strategy from 2017 to 2020 for the Labour Party. So I've worked for two very different Labour parties in two very different eras, but in similar roles. Okay, so I think everyone will have an idea of what the polling is looking like. The media is saturated with polling. So I'm just going to take you through each aspect of it quite quickly and try and put everything I can into some context, try and pull bits of the jigsaws together to try and explain why we're looking at what we think we're looking at. And then I will take any questions. So first of all, everyone knows the Conservatives are really struggling. And as I said, they're fighting at the moment to come second. They are in the worst position you could be for a national political party, which is mean you're being squeezed to your left and you're being squeezed to your right. You're being squeezed by socially conservative voters in the north and the Midlands, and they're being squeezed by more liberal voters in the south and the southwest. So this is creating a perfect or terrible storm for the Conservatives, which, as I'll explain on when we get to our MRP slide, what it means. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Can you move slides? Okay, so just this is what you'll see on the news, on your social media feeds every day. This is the most up-to-date voter intention poll we have from Survation, and that is broadly replicated across different polling companies. Labour has been coming down very slightly from the 45s at the start of the campaign down to 40 or 41 in most polls, and the Conservatives have been coming down from about 26, 27 at the start of the campaign to where they are now. The interesting one to look at is Reform UK. It slightly depends on what sort of methodology the polling companies use. We fully prompt in our questionnaires for Reform, and that is on average where they are now. They've been higher in some polls and lower. A lot of people are saying that Reform are going to cross with the Conservatives, but in the week or so since Nigel Farage announced his participation in the campaign, they haven't really moved up beyond the 12 to 15 points mark. So I think them getting more votes than the Conservatives is unlikely at this stage. Okay, could you next slide, please? Okay, so if you look at how the voting intention has moved since January 2020. There's just some the Conservatives were enjoying a big lead under Boris Johnson. You can see him starting to come down around the time of the COVID and Partygate stuff. The big gap between the parties you might recognise as the Liz Truss premiership. Conservatives started to recover a little bit under Rishi Sunak, but basically not much has changed in the last year, in the last 2 years, really. Next slide, please. Okay, now something that you will have all heard of, and some of you will know and understand, and some of you won't understand as much, is we're using what's called MRP polling. And you can see what that stands for. What it basically means is when you had a more stable political system where there was two main parties, possibly the Liberal Democrats or Liberals. We used to use in polling what's called uniform national swing. So you could more or less apply what the national polling said across the country, and you would more or less be able to predict how many seats each party would win. But this has massively changed in the last 10 years with the national voter swing not being uniform and votes being distributed in all sorts of different places. So for example, this is not so much in this election, but certainly in the last election and the election before that, you had big differentials according to Brexit voting patterns. So what we do with MRP polls is we do large national samples. So we don't sample each different constituency in large enough numbers to do a seat poll, but we take in about 20 different demographic, social attitudes, and lifestyle data, which is typical of that seat that we're looking at, and we can make a forecast based on that model. And we are currently forecasting Labour to have 487 seats and the Conservatives on 71 seats. So just take that in. We're not saying that will definitely happen, but our forecast is that if the election was today or tomorrow, we believe that that's the sort of result that you're looking at. And these MRP models have been accurate in the last two elections. In fact, in 2017, Survation's MRP poll was the only polling company that predicted a hung parliament, which proved right. So next slide, please. And I'll answer any questions on MRP polling that you might have at the end, because I know it is complicated. So if I can now try and explain why I think Labour are so far ahead and the Conservatives are in trouble. So the issues poll is very overwhelming, that the cost of living, NHS and the economy. I mean, actually, you could probably add the economy and cost of living together, which becomes even more overwhelming. So let's say the economy and the NHS are overwhelmingly the biggest issues in this election, with immigration quite high, certainly much higher than usual in usual elections, but still well below the big ones of cost of living and the NHS. If you go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so for Labour voters in 2019, the cost of living and health, NHS and the economy are also their top issues. So Labour voters are very much aligned here with what the overall national picture is. And if you go on to the next slide to show what the top issues for Conservative voters from 2019 are, you'll see that again is similar. The cost of living and health, the NHS are overwhelmingly, well, no, they're not overwhelmingly. Immigration is almost tying with cost of living and the NHS. So you can see that for Labour voters, they're very much aligned with the national picture. for Conservative voters, or what's left of Conservative voters, immigration is as big a priority for them as the NHS and the cost of living. So when you see the Conservatives and Reform battling out for votes from the 2019 cohort of Conservative voters, it is why immigration is such a prominent subject as part of that debate, because for this for this cohort of voters, it is as important as the cost of living and the NHS. Okay, so if you go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is a slide that shows all of the votes that the Conservatives got in 2019, and that was substantial. They had an excellent election result. They won a landslide on a large share of the vote. What this quite astonishingly shows us, and when presented like this, is currently the Conservatives are holding on to only half of the votes they got at the last election. All right. So when we ask people, if there was a general election tomorrow, who would you vote for? Only half of those who said only half of those that voted Conservative last time are currently saying they're going to vote Conservative this time. And where those votes have gone, it's pretty much a three-way split between Labour, Reform, and people that haven't yet made their minds up. Now, as you get closer to the election, the undecided figure at the bottom starts to get smaller, and it starts to get less significant. And you can't say for sure, but if people had voted Conservative in the past and they're still undecided, there's a high probability that they're not going to vote Conservative now. So they might not vote, some of them will vote Conservative, but we can probably guess that that will split again three ways between Labour, Reform, and possibly not voting, and some for the Liberal Democrats. So I hope this slide in particular shows you the full scale of the difficulty the Conservatives are in at the moment. The next slide, please. Okay, this is just making that point on immigration. So if you break down by voting intention how big a issue immigration is at this election, it's massive for Conservative voters, relatively small but not insignificant for Labour voters, and then you can see Reform UK, it's rather big again. Okay, if we can move on, please. Next slide. So just on we talk a lot about issues that are associated with the right. So talking about maybe tax cuts, immigration, but there's also issues on the more liberal progressive side. And just to show you there that in fourth place there, below the economy and health and immigration, is the environment and climate change. So that is a big issue, and that probably is one of the issues that is influencing Conservatives losing votes to the left of them, which might be to the Lib Dems, Labour and the Greens, even in some parts of the country. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, please. Okay, who do the voters trust? Right. So this is a slide that shows that on every single issue other than defence, Labour are in the lead. And even on defence, they're more or less tied. So if you go back a few slides to what are the big issues that people care about, economy, cost of living, NHS and immigration, even on immigration, Labour are in the lead. They're ahead of the Conservatives, which is totally new and it's totally unprecedented. On jobs, if you consider that a cost of living issue, which I think most people do, Labour is well in the lead. Pensions, education, which isn't such a large election issue. Health in the NHS, Labour's got a 20-point lead. Cost of living, Labour's got a 13-point lead. Yeah, so I just think if you're trying to contextualize why the polls are showing what they are, we in the media we debate from day to day who did well in the debate last night, who made a campaign gaffe yesterday. I think some of that is important on the margins, but I think this slide, along with the issues that matter most to people, really brings it together and shows that on the really big issues, Labour are more trusted than the Conservatives. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I've been sort of running and working on general elections for a long time and done many elections, and every election boils down to whether it's a change election where people want change, or whether it's an election where people want stability and and want a continuation of what's gone before. Now, if when you ask people in polling, do you want change? Something like 95% of them will say yes. It's something that everyone wants. So we don't ask it in that way. We use sort of indicators, and one of them is, do you believe the country is broken? If they say yes in large numbers, then it means that people are in the mood for change. So this is definitely a change election, and that is Labour has definitely won the change mantle. Now, funnily enough, in governments, it's not always opponents and oppositions that can win the change argument in an election. Boris Johnson did a brilliant job in 2019 of presenting himself as the change candidate. I will get Brexit done. Okay, I will sort out the mess. I will do that. So it's not always the case that oppositions are for change. Okay. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, this is just more of the same. Again, Rachel Reeves has had a pretty consistent lead over Jeremy Hunt as who you trust most on the economy. And the next slide, please. Now, this has been quite a hard deal for Keir Starmer to seal. One of the interesting factors about this election is, in spite of Labour having a substantial lead over the Conservatives, Keir Starmer, his own ratings have been more modest. So Labour's favourability ratings and Labour's support has consistently outdone Keir Starmer's. And we do lots of focus groups, and you've seen a lot of focus group sort of research and evidence that shows that people don't know Keir Starmer that well, and they're not quite sure what he'd do or what he stands for. And as a result, if you look at who would make the best prime minister, it's been relatively neck and neck, although he does now have a big lead over Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak has spent the last 6 months fighting it out with don't know over who would make the best prime minister. Okay, if you could move on to the next slide, please. Okay, you can see the party favourability. It's more clear and consistent there, with Labour ahead of the Conservatives since May 2023. So that's the last year. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Could you skip this and then move back to the conclusions? I've got some more slides after this. Okay. So one of the I mean, businesses only have a vote each. People that run businesses of all sizes only get one vote, but they are a big influencer in the election. And if you saw the manifesto launch from Labour, it was very laser targeted towards reassuring business, and they put a lot of their messaging around growth and the role that businesses and private investment will have in economic growth. Now, traditionally, business supports the Conservatives, but just running what data we have available on what businesses are thinking at the moment. So just a couple of slides on this, but a poll by Focal Data, so kind of not Survation on this occasion, had Starmer more in touch with what businesses need than Sunak by 49% to 34%. So that is quite a turnaround from the traditional Conservative supporting businesses that you'd expect. On the issue of regulations, again, a traditional sort of business lobbyists and influencers would traditionally ask for less regulation. The majority of businesses polled believe the Labour government will increase business regulation, but interestingly, they don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, and they think that could be a positive factor for their business. Okay, that might be something you want to discuss after this presentation. The next slide, please. Who do businesses support? Now, as I said before, each person that works in business who owns businesses only gets the same vote that everyone else gets, but it's also interesting who they actually support. And the answer is inconclusive. More than half have not yet made up their minds who to vote for. And this was a survey from last week. They are concerned the next government will put up business taxes. And Labour has spent a large amount of time over the last week or so, and at its manifesto launch a couple of hours ago, insisting that other than the taxes that they've announced, like closing loopholes on non-DOMs, and there's another one that I haven't quite got back, but Labour has spent a lot of time ruling out that they'll put up any additional business taxes, but that is a concern of small businesses. Okay, could we have the next slide, please? Okay, a survey of 500 financial decision makers in SMEs at the end of May, so it's about 2 weeks old. This won't come as any surprise to you, but it's always worth seeing that rising costs are the top issue of SMEs, and that's gone up, not hugely, it's gone up 5% in the last year. I mean, I think that's significant because if the government was believed by small businesses, their rhetoric, who argue that costs have gone down, you might expect to see that number changing, but it's actually gone up. 57% are concerned about supply chain disruptions, and half of people are apprehensive about a change of government, which I think is interesting, but given that they will be expecting a Labour government, it will be interesting to do some new polling on seeing if they've been reassured by what Labour has been saying during the campaign. Okay, could you go back 3 slides to the conclusion, please? That's it. Okay, so to try and pull this all together, if the evidence of what we can see in our polling models, our polling happens, that will be the largest majority in Labour's history, and it would leave the Conservatives fighting for its life effectively. And you can already see talks of mergers with the Reform Party, Nigel Farage becoming the opposition leader. these are conversations that no one has ever had seriously, but they are conversations that are starting to happen now. And that's because of the expected scale of the Conservative defeat that's expected. We in the polling industry don't believe that these polls are wrong. And if you look at all of the indicators that I've shown you, the issues that people are most interested in, who the voters trust on those issues the most, it all points towards the Labour lead being real and sustainable over the coming weeks. And as I said, Labour even leads on immigration. So we talked about change. People definitely want change. They're definitely in a change mood. One issue for Labour is that the voters don't necessarily view them as offering change. So Labour and Keir Starmer are fighting an incredibly cautious campaign. If you're 20 points ahead in the polls, you don't want to do anything which potentially could upset that. But the risk to that is that voters want to see more. They want to see maybe something a bit more exciting, maybe something a bit bigger than they're being offered. So there is a risk for Labour, not of losing the election, but there is a risk that they will depress their own turnout. So while they're currently on 40% and above, there is a risk that that is going to come down to more like the sort of 37, 38, or even slightly lower, which would still deliver them a massive majority because of the way votes are currently distributed in the country. But it might also take some of the shine off their mandate if their actual vote share is lower than they were anticipating. We talked about business. I think the sense from business's opinion is they do feel more assured by Labour's offer than usual, and are probably relatively pleased that Labour isn't pledging any new business taxes. I'm going to conclude there and take questions. I hope that this has helped with some of the context of all the polls that you're seeing all over the place at the moment on the news and on social media. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Carl. That was great. Really interesting. A couple of questions from me. If anyone's got any questions, please do put them into the chat now. First question was that slide that you had with the 2019 Conservative voters. Obviously, Boris Johnson got a big majority back in 2019, a point majority of about 80, I think. Lots of people who wouldn't traditionally vote Conservative voting Tory on that occasion because of getting Brexit done. You said there was 13% of those 2019 Conservative voters who are currently undecided. What would happen if they came back to the Tories, if you like? Would that mean that the Conservatives could essentially eat into Labour majority or even create a hung parliament?
It's not going to be the case that all of those currently saying they're undecided will vote Conservative. That's an interesting question, and it slightly depends on where they are. So if the 13%, this is a really interesting question, but let's just talk our way through it. If the 13% came back to the Conservatives, that would mean the Conservatives are retaining about 63%, so about 2/3 of their 2019 vote. So that would put 2/3 of their vote share. Yeah, I think you'd be in hung parliament territory.
There we go. So they're the voters. The
It's not going to happen, James.
Well, not a vote has been cast yet. Postal votes go in next week, I believe. One other question for you. There's a couple coming in the chat, which we will take. Tactical voting. So people are much more sophisticated now. Tactical voting is normally used against the Conservatives potentially against the SNP in Scotland. How much of a factor will that be in this election?
I think that is going to be a really big factor, and it's showing in the MRP models. And it's difficult to measure that accurately in headline polling, because people tend to say who they would vote for, as in who they like, rather than who they like the least as such. But you can see the Lib Dems surging in and predicted to win seats, in the southwest, and that is a result of tactical voting. I think actually the Conservatives are being squeezed by tactical voting, and from their left and their right, from their Liberals and their Social Conservatives, are being squeezed all over the place ideologically and through tactical voting.
There was, the other half of the question was about Scotland. We've got a question in the chat here.
Yeah.
How many seats do you think SNP will get on polling basis, and how many do you think the Greens might get? They've currently got one. Predictions they might get one in Bristol as well. Is that
okay? So yeah, the SNP. We're generally predicting Labour to win the popular vote share in Scotland. So that would, I don't know I don't know is the answer, but the SNP currently hold most seats in Scotland, so you could expect that to go down by half, probably, at least.
And the Greens, do you think they'll get a second MP, or
the Greens
hold on to their existing one?
Well, their existing one is gone, and I believe there's a bit of uncertainty, but I believe that seat polls and MRP projections show the Greens keeping that seat in Brighton, and they show pretty clearly the Greens now ahead in Bristol Central, I believe it is.
That's currently a Labour seat, isn't it?
It's currently a Labour seat, and yes, we're projecting that to go Green.
Okay.
So probably two. The Greens will probably win 2 seats.
Okay, that'd be unprecedented in this country under first past the post. Interesting to see if that plays out.
Yeah.
A question here from Michael Stewart. He says, the collapse in the Tory support, is that due to them going to the right to try and appease reform voters, and therefore leaving that centre ground, vacating that centre ground? Do you think that's one of the factors that's causing the collapse? I suppose you could also say, is it to do with 14 years of Conservative government, Liz Truss, and the various other factors? What's driving the collapse in support?
It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, I think. So, I think what's driven their collapse in support is 14 years. 14 years, and the last, probably from Theresa May onwards, Brexit, collapse of the cost of living crisis, NHS waiting list at record high. So I sound like a party political broadcast here. I think the substance of policy, the economy and health has led to their polling collapse. When parties get smaller, and when parties start to edge out, and when parties start to lose contact with the majority of the country, something the Conservatives have always been very, very good at. So once you start to slip, once things start to get chaotic, it allows the sort of smaller influences in that party. So if in the Conservatives, it would be the membership, it would be fear of Nigel Farage. It starts to make them more influential because they're effectively looking at these polls and thinking, we're going to get wiped out. What's the way that at least we can hold on to so many seats? What's the way that we can hold on to stop more slippage to reform, and you are going to drift to the right in that case. And it's a risky strategy because you could end up losing more. All parties do it.
And one final question before I'm going to invite our friends at DJ to come back in a second, because a couple of these questions are more relevant to them rather than polls. Do you think that come July the 5th or 6th, when everything's been counted, that the Conservatives will be the second largest?
I do.
So this Lib Dems won't overtake them, as some of the polls have suggested.
I don't think so. I think I think the Conservatives are survivors, if nothing else. It's very easy to write them off. I think they will just do enough to make lifelong Conservative voters just that little bit fearful of a Labour government.
Yeah, I
think that will just about, and to persuade them that Nigel Farage is a wasted vote.
Yeah, interesting to see what happens, and interesting to see if the predictions of the pollsters are correct as well. Given I'm old enough to remember 1992, which got it totally wrong, and the Brexit vote as well in 2016. That wasn't necessarily picked up, but I know the last time and the last couple of elections, the exit polls and the MRP polls have been absolutely spot on. So really fascinating stuff. Thank you for rejoining, Catherine. There's a question here which I think you're better placed to answer than Carl, because it's not a polling specific question. It's about Labour and Labour manifesto. I know you've got a couple of points around what Labour might do in their first 100 days. Perhaps we'll come on to that in a sec. But before we do that, there's a question here about Labour manifesto and the EU, and the single market and customs union. They say they want to make Brexit work, as I'm sure everyone does. Some people would say it's working better than others, but that's a different point. What will they do in terms of their EU policy, and how will they sort of build those barriers in trade without rejoining the single market or customs union?
Now, I haven't yet read the Labour manifesto on this particular point, but as we know, and as you alluded to there, James, Brexit is an incredibly sensitive topic still politically. And I know from conversations that I've had directly with Rachel Reeves that Labour just does not want to talk about Brexit or the EU, particularly at the moment, because it's just too politically sensitive, and they want to just ride it out and do as well as they can in the general election. In terms of what I think Labour will actually do once they're in power, Europe is our biggest trading partner, and we need to find a way to ensure that we can trade with them and that we can get economic benefit. Labour's pitch is to grow the economy. Labour has to grow the economy. It's not going to raise taxes, or they're limited in terms of the taxes that it can raise. And they won't want to make huge swathes of spending cuts, although they are going to have to in the spending review that will happen next year. So growth is the answer that they're going for. It's something that they put front and centre of their manifesto. To grow, they need to trade, and they need to have a very strong relationship with Europe. So I think they will look to renegotiate a better trading relationship with the EU. They won't rejoin Europe, and let's see what happens in Europe. Obviously, we've just had the European elections and things are looking quite tumultuous over on the continent at the moment, but I think they will look to forge a much stronger trading relationship and better trading agreements with Europe, because it's one absolutely essential component to economic growth in this country.
And just in terms of Labour policy, we've seen an announcement a couple of days ago about banning energy drinks for under 16s, which is something that potentially affects our sector. Also, there were some comments in the manifesto around promotional bans. What do you think Labour will do in terms of that health agenda on food and drink?
Yeah, well, they've set out two relatively ambitious policies, actually, given that it's a cautious manifesto. It's quite bold, and I think it took many by surprise that Labour said they would come out and ban energy drinks for under 16s. It's been something, as we all know, that's been kicked around for a very long time, and then it effectively got shelved under Boris Johnson's administration. Labour look like to come forward and do it. They've said they're going to do it. It's a relatively easy thing for them to implement and a relatively easy win for them. They've also said, as you mentioned, that they're going to restrict advertising on junk food. So I think Labour will want to make some bolder moves than this government has around health and food, but I still think they'll be cautious because you can end up, they want to stay on side with business, and I don't think they'll be as bold as some fear on this agenda.
And then a sort of related question in the chat here about alcohol duties. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen, but do you think the duties will go up? And I suppose the other question is minimum unit pricing in England. Are they likely to bring that in, do you think?
Again, I haven't read the detail of the manifesto, so don't catch me out by saying actually it's 7.1 in the manifesto. It says they're going to do
I don't
it.
think it is.
But,
it's very, not detail,
okay.
no detail in there.
I think that minimum unit pricing is still a way off. The civil servants, as we know from the discussions that we've had, don't want to do minimum unit pricing in England. It's been taken off the table in England for now. And so I suspect that will be the firm advice they get through from the civil servants when they come in. I haven't seen a great push from Labour to look at it. In terms of whether duties will go up, they are going to have to increase duties. They're going to have to increase taxes somewhere. So we will see some rises, particularly this far out from the next election. If Labour does want to increase taxes, of course, early on in their period, early on in their term is the time to do it. I don't think there'll be radical increases. They're a Labour government. The last thing they want to do is whack 10p on everybody's pint. However, they are going to have to make some really difficult decisions to enable them to unlock growth and to try and get the economy going at what is still a really difficult time.
So we heard from Carl in his presentation around the voters' concerns. Perhaps it was biggest, I think, amongst Reform, then Conservative, then everybody else around immigration. So there's a question here in the chat about immigration rules. What do you think Labour's policy, Catherine, would be on in terms of, allowing more migrants in potentially to do the jobs that we need in our supply chain? Do you think they're more likely to be more open to that than the Conservatives, given that people are saying that they're concerned about immigration? What do you think Labour's position will be after the election, should they win, of course?
But Labour has shown more flexibility on this than the Conservatives for obvious reasons. It's such a sensitive issue for Conservative voters. The Conservatives are also battling against Reform. This is a very big totemic issue for Reform. So the Conservatives are instinctively limited on what they want to do. They're committed to the Rwanda policy, plus they're trying to stop the sway of the votes heading off to the right. Labour are likely to still be very cautious. They know it's a sensitive area, and they will be winning seats regaining seats in an area where immigration, in the blue wall, the red wall, where immigration is a very, very sensitive issue still. So they will tread carefully, but I think they will be more open-minded to increasing the number of workers that can come over. They need to boost growth. They'll be more pragmatic than the Conservatives might be, because they're less philosophically constrained.
And Carl, in terms of the polling, do you think if Labour, obviously they've set out their stall now, but if they were to have a slightly more open view in terms of immigration, would that cost them votes, do you think?
I don't think so. I think as long as I think, how can I put it? I think that it's possible that the previous Labour government took quite a hit on the issue by not really being open and honest about it, and sort of predicting not many numbers of people coming to, as migrants, than it being much, much more. I suspect that Keir Starmer, the sort of civil servant in him and the sort of manager in him, will be cautious, as you said, but I think if they're going to change the rules to be slightly more liberal, I just think they'll be open about it and say this is why this number are needed. And I think they would, as long as the economy is growing and the cost of living is improving, and they're honest and open about a slightly more liberal approach to immigration, I think they will not lose votes over it.
Okay, interesting to see what happens.
Yeah.
I think we've got a slide on Labour's first 100 days. Catherine, have you
Shall I just pick up the question on VAT?
Yes,
Someone's
go for
asked
it on
about
VAT. Yes,
VAT. Very exciting question on VAT.
there we go. That's what we're here for.
And obviously Carl and I have been making predictions that will be completely disproven in about a month's time. But yeah, we're hostages to fortune, but we're doing our best. But in terms of that, and again, I haven't got a crystal ball, we know there is going to be a budget. Rachel Reeves is going to do her first budget or autumn statement, fiscal statement in September. Well, that's very much the indication that they've given. They won't come in and do an emergency budget straight away. Partly they don't want to do what Liz Truss did, because they know that they can come in, make radical changes before the OBR's properly looked at it, and everything can rapidly backfire. So they're learning their lessons. And we've spoken to the Labour team about this. They're terrified of doing a Liz Truss. So they're going to be cautious and they're going to think about their budget before they go ahead and do it. But we know it's likely to be in September. Will they change that? They are, as we talked about, they're going to have to increase some taxes. My instinct is that they're going to try and look at increasing taxes that are progressive, or that do. The problem with VAT, increasing VAT, A, it's already higher than it used to be, so I don't think they'll increase it more. B, if you increase it, it dampens demand. And C, it hits everybody in the same way because everybody pays VAT. But there are other taxes which obviously become higher as you become richer, like income tax. So I think they're likely to look to change more progressive taxes that hit better off people ahead of changing something like VAT, which hits everybody, including people on lower incomes, in the same way.
And tellingly, they haven't ruled out increasing corporation tax. We've got one of the lowest corporation tax rates in Europe. They've said they haven't said they're not going to raise it, which indicates they probably will.
But they've said they are going to protect personal taxes, which that would probably fall into, well, more or less would fall into.
Yeah. Okay. Labour's first 100 days, what are they going to do in the last couple of minutes?
Lewis is going to show the slides on this. We've just got 5 minutes left, so we'll rattle through. I'll start off and then Lewis will chip in as well. So flying through onto the next slide. So going back one. So in terms of Labour's first 100 days, we've talked a lot about this already. The King's speech setting out the legislative programme is likely to be on the 17th of July. In terms of what we think we will see in that legislative programme, we think there will be proposed tax reforms that come through in the budget. We know that they are going to increase VAT on private schools and also on what's called non-DOMs, people who are not resident here and don't pay tax as they should. So we know that those are two definite areas that taxes are going to go up. Other priority areas for legislating include an employment bill. You would have seen that there's Labour's New Deal for Working People, which sets out reforms around hire and fire, things like access to parental leave and parental rights from day one. So we know there's going to be rapidly introduced an employment bill. There was a bill around renting and particularly looking at issues around no fault evictions and landlords being able to evict people. And that bill, which was actually in existence under the Conservatives, is likely to be brought back very quickly, as is a water bill. Other priorities, just to touch on, will be planning. We know that Labour has got bold ambitions on planning and really wants this to be a defining part of what they do in this period of government. They want to come in and really shake up our planning laws. They also want to put in place a new national energy company called GB Energy and look at rail and bringing rail into national ownership as well, and also set up a national wealth fund. I think Labour broadly in their first 100 days, this is their moment. They will have an enormous majority, a huge mandate. They haven't been in power for 14 years. A huge mandate means that they will be able to push through bits of legislation that they want. They've got 5 years. If they're going to do stuff, now is the time in this first period to really put bold ideas out there, to really try and get big bits of legislation through. And I think we will see Labour coming in full of energy, full of ambition, and a lot of announcements happening in what we call the first 100 days, or between now and Christmas. There'll be a huge amount of announcements from the Labour Party as they try and really hit the ground running in this first period of government, having not been in government for a long period of time. And then just quickly on the manifestos, we've got 3 minutes left. Lewis is going to touch on these.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to speak to you all today. So yes, just touching on what Catherine said previously. So this week we've had all the main political parties publish their manifestos, and so on this slide we just kind of captured some of the key policies that we think will impact the wholesale sector. And some of these have already been discussed, such as the New Deal for Working People. But also in the Labour manifesto, they've announced today that they will be changing the remit of the Low Pay Commission. And as part of this, they will now account for the cost of living. And also they will be removing the discretionary age bans on national minimum wage. In addition to this, and something that all the main parties on this page have committed to, is reforming the apprenticeship levy, which currently is facing issues with being quite inflexible. And instead they want to branch it out into a wider growth and skills levy, which will help prevent the huge sums of money which are currently being returned to the Treasury each year that can't be used under the current arrangements. On top of this, they've also committed to half of all public sector food being locally produced. And if this is not the case, then they've said that they will be certified to a much higher environmental standard. On top of this, and this is something that builds on the work that was done in the criminal justice bill that was previously being worked on before the general election was called, is that there will be an offence for assaults on shop workers, and we'd expect that this would also be extended to include wholesale workers, as there was a previous amendment that was secured for this that unfortunately was dropped with the bill. And then finally, within the manifesto, Labour have said that they will be committed to implementing the Windsor framework. And as part of this, we look to protect the UK internal market. So there could be issues arising around things such as not for EU labelling, which is at the moment unworkable for the industry, and there'll be a job to do there to make sure that isn't overburdensome for wholesalers. And then just looking into the Conservative and Liberal Democrats quickly, on top of this, we've had the Conservatives also committed to bringing forward the Tobacco and Vapes Bill, which was part of the work they were doing again before the general election. And also, notably in the Liberal Democrat manifesto, they talked about extending free school meals to all children in poverty, and also with the ambition to extend it all to children in primary schools. And finally, they've also said that they will be introducing a more comprehensive national food strategy. And it's worth noting that although it wasn't specifically mentioned in the Labour Party manifesto today, the deposit return scheme and extended producer responsibility is currently slated for a 2027 implementation. So this will form a big part of the work that Labour does under their government. And I don't know if there's any time left, but we'd very quickly prepared, just on this next slide, just a range of the policies that are likely to affect businesses in the wholesale sector and their likelihood. And under a Labour government, we've identified those that are going to be most likely. So touching on some of the things that's already been discussed, the strengthening of workers' rights, that will form part of the New Deal for Working People. So we expect that to be very likely under a Labour government. As has already been mentioned today, there's going to be a ban on HFSS foods promotions and the sale of energy drinks to under 16s. The deposit return scheme and extended producer responsibility that I just mentioned there, and also the issues around the Windsor framework will be a lot more likely to be coming up, and therefore will have to be assessed for business impact. So I think that's everything that we had to add on the manifestos and the policy changes, but I don't know if Catherine, you've got anything else to add there.
We're out of time, I know, but if anyone would like to talk to us more, we're very happy to continue the conversation.
Yeah, please do let us know here at FWD. And I think that probably brings things to a conclusion. So thank you very much, Carl, Lewis and Catherine. Thanks to everybody for dialing in. Thanks for all your brilliant questions. And we will see you hopefully on the 27th of June in Manchester for the FWD annual conference. But we will continue to keep you informed about what's happening with the election as we head towards July the 4th. So thanks very much, everybody, and have a good rest of day.